Welcome to Bed Crime Stories podcast. I'm your host, T. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, bed crimers. As always, I wish you the best. To anyone new here, a warm welcome. Thank you for checking out my channel. Let me just ask that after listening to or watching this video, if you learned something or enjoyed it, please do me a favor and smash that like button. Now, let's dig in. The day before Serialist Ted Bundy was executed after finally being caught for his years of doing in young females from Washington State all across the country to Florida, he met with Reverend Dr. James Dobson. In this final conversation, Bundy appears to have finally thrown down his shield of lies and replaced it with some truth. As we try to understand what would drive someone to commit the type of vicious crime that occurred in Moscow, Idaho, and saw the lives of Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernodle, Kaylee Gonsalves, and Maddie Mogan extinguished in less than 20 minutes, I thought Bundy's explanation for what he thought may have led to his violent compulsions could shed light on the motivations of the perpetrator of the November 13th, 2022 attack at 1122 King Road, an address that I think we will never forget. Can we believe everything Bundy says here? Things like he found Jesus Christ in prison? I'm not sure. But I do think this is probably the most honest Ted Bundy ever was. Now I'm going to read you the conversation, and I'll be toggling between the Reverend's questions and Bundy's responses. Thus, I'll try to use slightly different voices, nothing wild and crazy to distract you. I'll spare you my attempt at a Cockney accent because it would likely leave you in fits of laughter, and that would be inappropriate for the mood of this reading. Let us begin. The first voice is that of Reverend Dobson. Ted, it is about 2:30 in the afternoon. You are scheduled to be executed tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock if you don't receive another stay. What is going through your mind? What thoughts have you had in these last few days, Ted Bundy? I won't kid you to say it's something I feel I'm in control of or have come to terms with, because I haven't. It's a moment-by-moment thing. Sometimes I feel very tranquil, and other times I don't feel tranquil at all. What's going through my mind right now is to use the minutes and hours that I have left as fruitfully as possible and see what happens. It helps to live in the moment, in the essence that we use it productively. So right now, I'm feeling calm, in large part because I'm here with you, Reverend Dobson. For the record, you're guilty of killing many women and girls. Yes, that's true. Ted, how did it happen? Take me back. What are the antecedents of the behavior that we've seen? So much grief, so much sorrow, so much pain for so many people. Where did it start? How did this moment come about? That's the question in the hour, and one that not only people more intelligent than I are working on for years, and one that I have been working on for years and trying to understand it. Huh, that was a laugh. He laughed. Is there enough time to explain it all? I don't know. I think I understand what happened to me to the extent that I can see how certain feelings and ideas have developed in me to a point that I began to act out on them. Some very violent and very destructive feelings. Well, let's go back then to those roots. First of all, you, as I understand it, were raised in what you consider to be a healthy home. Absolutely. You were not physically abused. You were not SA'd. You were not emotionally abused. No, in no way. And that's part of the tragedy of this whole situation, because I grew up in a wonderful home with two dedicated and loving parents, as one of 5 brothers and sisters, a home where we as children were the focus of my parents' lives. We regularly attended church, 2 Christian parents. They did not drink, they did not smoke, There was no gambling, there was no physical abuse or fighting in the home. I'm not saying this was Leave It to Beaver. Reverend Dobson then said, one perfect home. And Ted Bundy replied, no, I don't believe that such a home exists. It was a fine, solid Christian home. And nobody, I hope no one will try to take the easy way out and try to blame or otherwise accuse my family of contributing to this, because I know, and I'm trying to tell you as honestly as I know how, what happened. And I think this is a message that we can get across. But as a young boy, and I mean a boy of 12 or 13, certainly, I encountered outside the home again, in the local grocery store and the local drugstores, soft core pornography, or what people say soft core, as I've explained to you last night, that this anecdote that as young boys we explore the back doors and the sideways and byways of their neighborhoods, and oftentimes the people would dump the garbage and whatever they're cleaning out of their house. From time to time, we came across pornographic books of a harder nature than a more graphic, you might say, a more explicit nature of what we would encounter, let's say, in your local grocery store. And this also included things as, let's say, detective magazines. And Reverend Dobson says, those included violence? Yes. And this is something that I want to emphasize. This is the most damaging kinds of pornography. And again, I'm talking from personal experience, hard, real personal experience. So the most damaging kinds of pornography are those that involve violence and sexual violence, because the wedding of those two forces, as I know only too well, brings about behavior that is just too terrible to describe. Reverend Dobson, walk me through that. What was going on in your mind at that time? Okay. Well, before we go any further, it's important to me that people believe what I'm saying, and to tell you that I'm not blaming pornography. I'm not saying it caused me to go out and do certain things. I take full responsibility for whatever I've done and all the things that I've done. That's not the question here. The question and the issue is how this kind of literature contributed and helped mold and shape kinds of violent behavior. Reverend Dobson, it fueled your fantasies. Fueled. Well, in the beginning, it fuels this kind of thought process. Then, at a certain time, it is instrumental in crystallizing it, making it into something which is almost a separate entity inside. And that points you at the verge. I was at the verge of acting out on this kind of fantasy. Reverend Dobson. Now, I really want to understand that. You had gone about as far as you could go in your own fantasy life with printed material, and you may, or printed in video or films, magazines, whatever. And then there was the urge to take that little step, big step over to a physical event. Well, it happened in stages, gradually. It doesn't necessarily, not to me at least, happened overnight. My experience with, I'd say, pornography generally, but with pornography that deals on a violent level with sexuality, is that once you become addicted to it, and I look at this as a kind of addiction, like other kinds of addiction, you keep looking for more potent, more explicit, more graphic kinds of material. Like an addiction, you keep craving something which is harder and harder, something which gives you a greater sense of excitement, until you reach the point where the pornography only goes so far. You reach that jumping off point where you begin to wonder if maybe, which is just beyond reading about it and looking at it. Reverend Dobson, how long did you stay at that point before you actually assaulted someone. Well, yeah, you see, that is a very delicate point. In my own development, and we're talking about how to reach the point or a gray area that surrounded that point. Of course. Reverend Dobson, you don't remember how long? Ted Bundy, I would say a couple of years. And what I was dealing there was with very strong inhibitions against criminal behavior or violent behavior that had been conditioned into me, bred into me in my environment, in my neighborhood, in my church, in my school, things that said, no, this is wrong. I mean, even thinking of it is wrong. And certainly to do it is wrong. And I'm on that edge. And the last, I might say, the vestiges of restraint, the barriers to actually doing something would be tested constantly and assailed through the kind of fantasy life that was fueled largely by pornography. Reverend Dobson, do you remember what pushed you over that edge? Well, Reverend Dobson, do you remember the decision to go for it? Do you remember where you decided to throw caution to the wind? Bundy, again, when you say pushed, I don't want to. I know what you're saying, and I don't want to. Reverend Dobson, yes, I understand. Again, that I was some helpless kind of victim, and yet we're talking about an influence, which that is the influence of violent type of media and violent pornography, which was an indispensable link in the chain of behavior, the chain of events that led to behaviors, to the assaults, to the murders, and what? He also laughs right there, Ted Bundy. It's a very difficult thing to describe, the sensation of reaching that point where I knew that it was something, as you would say, that snapped, that I knew that I couldn't control it anymore. These barriers that I had learned as a child, that had been instilled in me, were not enough to hold me back with respect to seeking out and harming somebody. Reverend Dobson, would it be accurate to call that a frenzy, a sexual frenzy? Bundy, well, yes, that's one way to describe it, a compulsion, a building up of this destructive energy. Again, another fact here I haven't mentioned is the use of alcohol. What I think is what alcohol did in conjunction, let's say, with my exposure to pornography. Alcohol did reduce my inhibitions. At the same time, as the fantasy life that was fueled with pornography eroded them further. Reverend Dobson, in your early days, you were nearly always about half drunk as you did these things, is that right? Bundy, yes. Was that always true? I would say that was generally the case. Most. Reverend Dobson, if I can understand it now, there is this battle going on within. There are the conventions that you've been taught. There's the right and wrong that you learned as a child. And there is this unbridled passion fueled by your plunge into hardcore violent pornography. Those things are at war with each other. Bundy, yes. The Reverend, and then with the alcohol diminishing the inhibitions, you let go. Well, yes, you can summarize it that way, and that's accurate, sir. And it just occurred to me that some people would say that I've seen that stuff and it doesn't do anything to me. And I can understand that. Virtually everyone can be exposed to so-called pornography, and well, they're aroused and don't do anything wrong. Reverend Dobson, well, addictions are like that. They affect people more than they affect others. There is a percentage of people affected by hardcore pornography in a very violent way. That was a major component, and I don't know why I was vulnerable to it. All I know is that it had an impact on me that was just so central in the development of the violent behavior that I engaged in. Reverend Dobson, Ted, after you committed your first murder, what was the emotional effect on you? What happened in the days after that? Again, please understand that even all these years later, it's very difficult to talk about. Reliving it through talking about it is difficult, to say the least, but I want you to understand what happened. It was like coming out of some kind of horrible trance or dream. I can only liken it to after, and I don't want to over dramatize it, to have been possessed by something so awful and alien, and then the next morning wake up from it, remember what happened, and realize that basically in the eyes of the law, and certainly in the eyes of God, you're responsible. And to wake up in the morning and realize what I had done with a clear mind and all my essential moral and ethical feelings intact at that moment. Absolutely horrified that I was capable of doing something like that. Reverend Dobson, you really hadn't known that before? There is absolutely no way to describe first the brutal urge to do that kind of thing, and then what happens is once it is more or less satisfied and receded, you might say, or spent, like that sense, that kind of energy at a level receded, and basically I became myself again. And I want people to understand this too. I'm not saying this. It is important that people understand this, that basically I was a normal person. I wasn't some guy hanging out in bars or a bum. I wasn't a pervert in the sense that, people look at somebody and say, I know there's something wrong with him, and just tell. I was essentially a normal person. I had good friends. I led a normal life, except for this one small but very potent and very destructive segment of it that I kept very secret and very close to myself and didn't let anybody know about. And part of the shocking horror for my dear friends and family when years ago when I was first arrested was there was no clue. They looked at me and they looked at the, average American boy. And I mean, I wasn't perfect. I was okay. I was, the basic humanity and basic spirit that God gave me was intact, and unfortunately became overwhelmed at times. And some people need to recognize that it's not some kind of, those of us who have been so much influenced by violence in the media, in particular pornographic violence, are not some kinds of inherent monsters. We are your sons, and we are your husbands, and we grew up in regular families, and pornography can reach in and snatch a kid out of any house today. It snatched me out of my home 20, 30 years ago. And as diligent as my parents were, and they were diligent in protecting their children, and as a good Christian home as we had, and we had a wonderful Christian home, there's no protection against the kinds of influences that are loose in society that tolerates. You feel this really deeply, don't you, Ted? Outside these walls right now, there are several hundred reporters that wanted to talk to you. Yeah. And you asked me to come here from California because you had something you wanted to say. This hour that we have together is not just an interview with a man who is scheduled to die tomorrow. I'm here and you're here because of this message you're talking about right here. You really feel that hardcore pornography and the door to it, softcore pornography, is doing untold damage to other people and causing other women to be abused and killed the way you did, Ted Bundy. Listen, I'm no social scientist, and I haven't done a survey. I mean, I don't pretend that I know what John Q. Citizen, i.e. man on the street, thinks about this, but I've lived in a prison for a long time now, and I've met a lot of men who were motivated to commit violence just like me, and without exception, every one of them was deeply involved in pornography, without question, without exception, deeply influenced and consumed by an addiction to pornography. There's no question about it. The FBI's own study on serial homicide shows that the most common interest among serial killers is pornography. That's true, and it's real. It's true, Reverend Ed. What would your life have been like without that influence? Yeah, well, I know it would have been far better, not just for me, and it's excuse me for being so self-centered here. It would have been a lot far better for me and for a lot of other people. I know that. A lot of innocent other people, victims and families, they would have been a lot better. There's no question about that it would have been a fuller life, a life that would not have involved, I'm absolutely certain would not have involved this kind of violence that I have committed. I'm sure, Ted, if I were able to ask you the questions that are being asked out there, one of the most important as you come down to perhaps your final hours, are you thinking about all those victims out there and their families? Well, who are so wounded, years later, their lives have not returned to normal. They will never return to normal. Absolutely. Are you carrying that way? Is there remorse there? Again, I know that people will accuse me of being self-serving, but we're beyond that now. I mean, I'm just telling you how I feel. But through God's help, I've been able to come to the point where much too late, but better late than never, feel the hurt and the pain that I'm responsible for. Yes, absolutely. In the past few days, myself and a number of investigators have been talking about unsolved cases, murders that I was involved in. And it's hard to talk about all these years after because it revives in me all these terrible feelings and those thoughts that I have steadfastly and diligently dealt with, and I think successfully with the love of God. And yet it's reopened, and I feel and I felt the horror again and all that. And I can only hope that those who I have harmed, those to whom I have caused so much grief, even if they don't believe my expression of sorrow and remorse, will believe what I'm saying now, that there are loose in their towns, in their communities, people like me today whose dangerous impulses are being fueled day in and day out by violence in the media in its various forms, particularly the sexualized violence. And what scares me, and let's come into the present now, because what I'm talking about happened 20 or 30 years ago. That is in my formative stages. What scares me, Dr. Dobson, is when I see what's on cable TV. Some of the violence in the movies that come into homes today with stuff that they wouldn't show in X-rated adult theaters 30 years ago. This stuff, Reverend Dobson, is that slasher movies that you're talking about? That stuff is, I'm telling you from personal experience, the most graphic violence on screen, particularly as it gets into the homes to children when they'll be unattended or unaware that they may be a Ted Bundy who has that vulnerability, that predisposition to be influenced by that kind of behavior, by that kind of movie, by that kind of violence. There are kids sitting out there switching the TV dial around, and they come upon these movies late at night, or I don't know when they're on, but they're on, and they keep watching. It's scary when I think of what would have happened to me if I had seen that. Was scary enough. Well, I just ran to stuff outside the home, but to know that children are watching that kind of thing today, or can pick up their phone and dial away for it or send away for it. Dr. Dobson, can you help me understand this desensitization process that took place? What was going on with your mind? Well, that desensitization, I describe it in specific terms, is that each time I'd harmed someone, each time I killed someone, there had been an enormous amount, especially at first, enormous amount of horror, guilt, and remorse afterwards. But then that impulse to do it again would come back even stronger. Now, believe me, the unique thing about how this worked, Dr. Dobson, is that I still felt in my regular life the full range of guilt and remorse, but other things and regret. And Dr. Dobson, do you have this compartmentalized? This compartmentalized, very well focused, very sharply focused area where it was like a black hole, it was like a crack, and everything that fell on that crack just disappeared. Does that make sense? Reverend Dobson, yes, it does. One of the final murders you committed in the course apparently was the little Kimberly Leach, who was 12 years of age. I think the public outcry is greater there because an innocent child was taken from a playground. What did you feel after that? Were there the normal emotions? Where were you, Ted? I can't really talk about that right now. That's too painful. I would like to be able to convey to you what that experience is like, but I can't. I won't be able to talk about that. Okay. I can't begin to understand. Well, I can try. I'm aware that I can't begin to understand the pain that the parents of these children that I have and these young women that I have harmed feel, and I can't restore really much to them, if anything. I won't pretend to, and I don't even expect them to forgive me. I'm not asking for it. That kind of forgiveness is of God. If they have it, they have it, and if they don't, maybe they'll find it someday. Reverend Dobson, do you deserve the punishment the state has inflicted upon you? That's a very good question. I'll answer really honestly. I don't want to die. I won't kid you. I can't kid you now. I deserve certainly the most extreme punishment society has, and I think society deserves to be protected from me and from others like me. That's for sure, I think. What I hope will come of our discussion is that I think society deserves to be protected from itself, because as we've been talking, there are forces at loose in this country, particularly, again, this kind of violent pornography, where on the one hand, well-meaning, decent people will condemn the behavior of a Ted Bundy while they're walking past a magazine rack full of the very kinds of things that send young kids down the road to be Ted Bundys. That's the irony. We're talking here not just about moral. What I'm talking about is to go beyond retribution, which is what people want with me. Going beyond retribution and punishment, because there's no way in the world that killing me is going to restore those beautiful children to their parents and correct and soothe the pain. But I'll tell you, there are lots of other kids playing in streets around this country today who are going to be dead tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next month, because other young people are reading the kinds of things and seeing the kinds of things that are available in the media today. Reverend Dobson, Ted, as you imagine, there is tremendous cynicism about you on the outside, and I suppose for good reason. Reverend Dobson, I'm not sure there's anything that you could say that people would believe. Yep. And yet you told me last night, and I have heard this through our mutual friend, John Tanner, that you have accepted the forgiveness of Jesus Christ and are a follower and believer in him. Do you draw strength from that as you approach these final hours? Bundy, I do. I can't say that being in the valley of the shadow of death is something I've become all that accustomed to, and that I'm strong and nothing's bothering me. Listen, it's no fun. It gets kind of lonely, and yet I have to remind myself that every one of us will go through this someday in one way or another. And countless millions who have walked this earth before us have gone through this. So this is just an experience which we all share. And that is the end of the conversation. This very much makes me wonder if suspect Bryan Kohberger spent any time looking at pornography or slasher movies. I know his sister was in one that was filmed locally in Pennsylvania, or horrible stuff on the dark web. If he goes to trial, will the prosecutors who are currently combing through all the data on his computers and phones, will they be able to show evidence of such behaviors over the years and months leading up to this crime? And is what Bundy said true? Was he being honest? It certainly sounds like it. And I can believe that that sort of thing could set off this fantasy stuff in the minds of people with anger issues, alienated people who suffer from antisocial personality disorders like Ted Bundy did. What saddens me is that this interview took place in 1989, and here we are in 2023, and what he's describing is still stuff that is plaguing our society. The availability of these images, so readily available now on the internet that it's even easier now for very young minds to get access to it. And could that trigger the same thing that Ted Bundy is describing? Well, I'm going to leave it there. I'll let you stew on that, let that marinate a little bit, and I'll see you next time on Bed Crime Stories. Hey, smash that like button. I'm going to need it. There's no way YouTube's going to let me monetize this video. And I'll see you next time.